You're listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast with Elliot Rowe and Dr. Trisha Gardner.
So welcome to the show. Trisha, what have you got for us this week?
Oh, and psychology news you can use. I've got something kind of hot. There was a study done where they looked at 3,000 people. They measured their personality, memory, thinking skills, and all this sort of thing. And they followed these 3,000 people over 25 years. Okay. And what's really interesting is that people who, when they were young adults, measured high in hostility and aggressiveness and had difficulties dealing with stress, 25 years later, they had worse memory and thinking skills. So it's pretty interesting because we don't know, because of the way the study was done, if being hostile and aggressive and not dealing with stress causes you to have the memory or thinking skills, or it could be the other way around, or it could be something totally unrelated or related. But nonetheless, it looks as though personality traits in some way have a bearing on how well we think and remember things. So I think it behooves us all to develop some good coping skills and maybe get rid of our hostility and anger as best we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not that surprising that people who have that sort of level of stress or anger can't think so clearly. So yeah, guys, work on yourselves out there. We're always pushing the meditation. We'll push it once again. Relax, meditate, really work on those things. And there is no need to be carrying around sort of huge emotions of anger and hostility. They are things that can be worked through meditation, through therapy, things like that. Definitely worthwhile, can change your life. So this week, we've got Matt Berkey coming on the show. He's a high-stakes player from Las Vegas, or who lives in Las Vegas. He plays in the big games, so he plays million-dollar hands of poker very frequently. And he's coming on to talk to us about what it's like to play in that game and also a new course that he's running. So let's give Matt a call. So Matt, thanks for coming on the show. If you could introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Matt Berkey. I've been playing poker for, I believe this is my 12th year, technically, probably 10th professionally. And I've mostly been a cash game specialist for the better part of that, though I have some tournament success.
You have a really interesting history, not just in poker, but even before poker, where you were real involved in athletics. And I think that does play a role in maybe your poker. And so I wonder if you'd speak to that for just a couple minutes.
Yeah, sure. I grew up basically admiring athletes. Like, school itself came pretty easy to me, so I never struggled too much with academics, but I was very disinterested in it. I was always enthralled by athletics. So by the age of 10, I had all but dedicated my life to baseball. And it was one of those things where I was never born with like enough God-given talent where I thought that it was just a given that I was going to play professionally. But in the back of my mind, I thought it was a given I was going to play professionally because I wanted it that badly. So I spent pretty much all of high school busting my ass, doing the best I could to ensure that I had a path moving forward. And, there was a lot of naysayers. Basically, even my coaches were telling me that I had very little chance at playing college ball. But that ended up proving not to be the point. I went and accepted an offer to a Division III school, sight unseen, just showed up first day of classes, the first time I'd been on campus, and worked really, really hard, only to have the coach at the end of my freshman season tell me that, basically he didn't think I was putting in enough work and effort and that I was cut. So early into my fall semester of my sophomore year, I just started scrambling. The cut didn't actually happen until fall semester of my sophomore year. I guess I should be more specific. So I just started scrambling, and I basically reached out to every coach that I'd ever been in contact with throughout high school. And most of them were, good programs that were already full and having to make cuts themselves, and they weren't just going to guarantee me that I could show up to campus and have a spot. But fortunately, being in Pennsylvania, there are a lot of pretty decent colleges within 2 hours of Pittsburgh. So the college I initially went to was Allegheny College, and right up the road in Erie, PA was Gannon University. And I had offers from them in high school as well. So I reached out to the coach. He said, "Hey, come up. We'd love to see you throw and see what you have." And by the end of that trip, I was, all but guaranteed a spot on the roster. So I ended up making the transfer. Played for 4 years, busted my hump, and kind of fell into poker in the process of all that. And basically used it as a method to try to get signed after college. So I would travel the East Coast and Midwest, going to all these professional tryouts, just trying to catch on anywhere and making tens of thousands in the process, playing like 5-10 in the local casinos. And eventually by like 2006, baseball started to fall by the wayside, where it was becoming clear that I was just too old to get a look. And poker was like very much on the uprise, where I was making, my parents' salary and then some. So, I mean, that's pretty much just like how I fell into it as an actual profession, I guess.
And just thinking of it that way, the treating poker as a sport, is that something that you've been doing in terms of the same amount of effort that you used to put into baseball?
Yeah, and actually it kind of follows the same timeline. Because as a kid, it's like I knew I wasn't naturally talented enough, but I also didn't know how to work. So I would just throw a ball against the wall for hours on end because it was something I could do by myself that I thought would result in me getting better. And, it had some effects. And poker was kind of the same way in the beginning. It's like I was kind of naturally good at it and didn't know how to get better. So I just kept playing. And fortunately, back then, games were so soft that was enough. And you began to like just understand things through trial and error. But eventually, much like what happened to me in high school and college, I understood that there was like a much deeper level of work to this. And in poker, in the aspect of poker, it was a lot of like studying game theory in a general sense. I know that term is like really hot right now in the poker world, and it applies to almost a specific strategy employed. But in the very broad sense of the word, just like general game theory mindsets, like one of the first problems I remember solving was the prisoner's dilemma, where if two people are taken into questioning and both confess to the crime, then they both get a lesser sentence. If one confesses and the other one doesn't, then one gets thrown under the bus and the other one gets no sentence. And if neither confess, then they both go to jail for a long time. And basically like not naturally understanding that both should never confess, because we're humans and we're born with some sort of empathy, and it just makes sense that like we should, be doing the things that will help each other out accordingly. But then, I studied computer science and math as well. So it's like understanding it from the mathematical sense of where logic just dictates that you should just never, ever, ever confess, because you reap longer term rewards from it. So like being introduced to things like that really allowed me to shift my mindset and how I thought about the game, and, move forward in a manner where I understood that we weren't just playing like the two cards that were dealt, but we're actually playing this mental war where you can manipulate your opponents and get them to do things that you want them to do.
Speaking of this mental war, one of the concepts that you are most known for, at least in my mind, is the pain threshold. Do you want to say something about that and just, kind of tell people what it is?
Yeah, I think that this is like a really important concept that kind of gets neglected. I don't know that I've necessarily coined it, but I know it's something I've certainly emphasized when it comes to anybody that I coach on my own. And basically it's just that, there's a certain comfort level we all possess when we're playing this game. Gambling doesn't necessarily come naturally to some people. Like, yeah, we have a natural inclination towards it, and taking risks is just a part of life. But in a very general sense, we've all evolved to being very risk averse. That's how we got this far, right? Was fear. The caveman who was wary of his predators and all the dangers outside and hung close to the cave and, hunted it at the appropriate hours and things like that. He was the one who passed his genes along because he lived long enough to do so. So there's a sense of fear that comes with risk. And we're playing a game where risk is exactly what's necessary in order to be good. So basically, a few years ago, it was probably about 5 years ago now, I began to understand like how commonplace the trends in poker were. 3xing in cash games was just like not only the norm, but the absolute standard. And if you did anything else, you were like looked at like you had two heads. And I never really stopped to question why, but I began to then. And it's just as simple as people that's what they're comfortable doing. They don't want to endure any pain. So I started showing up to 5-10 games, and I would open 5x, I would open 8x, 10x, whatever. And you just continually press this threshold of pain, and you start developing these large pots. And you basically get, at some point or another, there's a pivotal point where people reach their threshold of pain and now are no longer playing any sort of strategy. They're just resigned to playing fit or fold, because they're blinded by the fear and the risk that is all of a sudden presented in front of them. And that's true of everybody, no matter how high your threshold is. Somewhere along the line, you'll reach that pivot point where you can only play fit or fold from that point forward.
And this is something that, I mean, obviously stands out from your side because you are playing in some of the biggest games in the world, aren't you? So we're talking about here potentially $1 million hands of poker.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because people won't necessarily be aware of their threshold, right? So it's like, I'm playing with a bunch of 100 millionaires and they don't care about a single dollar that's in front of them necessarily. I mean, they care about every single penny, but they can risk it is what I'm getting at. Like they're way less at risk with 100,000 in front of them than I am. However, that doesn't make them comfortable. They're still only comfortable risking that amount when their knowledge equates to the risk. So the basic breakdown of that is just if they're in a scenario where they have the nuts, well, their knowledge is that they have the nuts and that they're very free to risk every single penny in front of them. As hands weaken, their knowledge begins to decrease because they don't understand the game quite as well. So with that big gap in knowledge comes a big fear of risk. And it's like you can leverage a guy out who has your net worth dwarfed by 1,000 times simply because he's unable to grasp the concept of pain threshold, I guess.
No, I just was at a camp that you put on. It was the Solve for Why Academy. And I think the most important thing I learned from you at the camp was every single hand or every pot goes through me. Do you want to talk about a little bit about that kind of philosophy and that idea that you take to the table?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that that's for everybody. Matter of fact, I think it's for very few. I mean, just being a product of the swings that come along with that mindset, it's like, it's an incredibly difficult strategy to employ, and it really requires a lot of precise off-the-table work in order to even get to a point where you can implement it. But that being said, it's like there are a lot of guys out there who play a laggy style who want to be all the action, but I think too few of them are calculated in what that actually means and the responsibilities that come along with it. So for me, the reason why I want to do that is because it makes my decision-making process simpler moving forward. If I'm dictating all the action, it means that most of my opponents are playing defense. And I can anticipate a lot of the ways that they'll counteract. So I'm basically taking them out of whatever strategy it is that they want to employ and forcing them into a counter strategy that they didn't necessarily prepare. So I'm basically spoon feeding them their strategy. Like, here's your counter strategy. This is what you're going to have to do against me. And so long as big bet poker exists, no limit and pot limit styles, this type of strategy will be the absolute most exploitive. It's also the most difficult to employ and the one where mistakes are extremely costly. I'm going to play the biggest pots, both on the winning and losing side. So my swings and variance are also going to be through the roof as well.
So be careful is what you're saying.
To say the least. Be studied is what it really comes down to.
And if you could just talk to us about the course that you're running and how perhaps it differs to other things that are available out there.
Yeah, so this is something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. A couple years ago, I did some work with Jason Somerville and Russell Thomas whenever Russ hired him to coach him for the main event final table. And I just love the idea of it. I really do enjoy the coaching aspect of the game. I enjoy learning myself and teaching and just being a part of all these things. But it was always a really slippery slope of, what kind of information do you want to get out there and at what level? And most of the training material that's available is done to the masses. So things like Run It Once where, there are videos available for thousands of people and stuff like that. And that never really interested me. So I kind of kicked the idea around for years and never acted on it. But I've had a couple students really push me towards doing this. Christian Soto being the main one, who's also a coach himself. And I just really like the idea. I have an RFID table that exposes hole cards and kind of allowed us to have this intimate setting where it's a small group of people. So you don't have to worry about the information being flooded in the market. And it's just really high level stuff. We're not trying to promote some sort of rule of thumb or quick fix or, gimmicky thing that's going to make somebody feel like they walked away with, the knowledge of all the top level pros. It's more so teaching people how to think and coach themselves to get to a level where they can continually move up the ranks.
So you just had a camp, and what did you think was the biggest takeaway that you saw? Like, just pick out in your mind the student who improved the most. And what do you think the student's takeaway was that made him or her improve the most?
Okay. I actually have a great example of this. So one of Christian's students, who was like a 2-5 regular, but still worked for a living, Nitin, came, and I think he had pretty high expectations of the camp, which was good. I wanted them all to. But I think that maybe I didn't do a good job of managing those expectations, in that I think they all expected to come in here and learn like a bunch of really crisp new lines that they had never thought of before, or how to be extra aggressive and things like that. So Nitin comes into the camp and he's pretty tight to the vest. He, much like his name, tended to be a little bit on the nitty side, right?
Right.
And his main emphasis and all of his questions revolved around, how can I change my image? And I had absolutely no concerns whatsoever with image. Like, to me, it's just a byproduct of all this other stuff, and your frequencies are actually going to be a lot of what controls your image. So I would kind of give him like roundabout answers like that, but still spoon feed him all of the material that we were trying to give. So throughout the course of the camp, the only thing I really wanted to have happen was to have people thinking differently, right? So like, I wanted to be able to promote thought processes that would allow the attendees to both deconstruct their opponent's strategies and then reconstruct their own in a manner that they thought was most profitable. I didn't want to just give them my strategy or tell them how they should play or anything along those lines. So with Nitin, one of the things I noticed most was he was very weak pre-flop despite being a tight player. And moving into day 2, when we broke down into small groups, I particularly sought him out and put him in a group with Jordan, who I feel to be extremely strong pre-flop. And I basically said, hammer it home to him, like, let's get these fundamentals into him so we can advance him forward, because he's a smart kid. He can think the way we want him to think. It's just he's lacking the mechanics right now. So he had a lot of pushback with that, right? Because it seemed trivial to him. It seemed like he was taking 20 steps backward at a camp where he paid to learn like high level crazy stuff. But he did learn what we wanted him to learn on day 2. And then day 3, we started to feed him a lot of the high level things. And when we went to play, I just saw a completely different person. He was crisp. He was doing everything he needed to do. He didn't miss a single spot. And nobody would have like accused him of being a nit. Granted, nobody would have accused him of being the loosest player at the table either, but that doesn't matter. He was employing a winning strategy. And the coup de grace to all that was when he gave his exit interview for the film crew and explained his whole part of the camp and everything else. He basically just said, like, something along the lines of, initially I was being very hard-headed and stubborn in my thought processes. I was just, labeling things very broadly and unwilling to change my opinions. But by the end, this was one of the best experiences of my life, because I've really broadened the way I think and I understand things from a lot of different angles. And to me, it's like, that's what this is all about, because poker is like such an ever-changing game where, we're just in the infancy of it, especially in the big bet formats, where, just everything is available to us and we can grow so much, both as like people, thinkers, and players, that it's like for a guy like that to completely shift his mindset over 72 hours means that we really did our job.
It was so funny because I remember night 1 and he was saying, nobody in my games, 4 bets, I'm never going to see this stuff. I'm never going to use this stuff. Right. And then by the last day, like, you didn't hear any more of that out of him. It was like the wheels were turning and you could see them turning. And so I thought it was really neat.
Yeah, rather than being resistant to change, he was actually adapting and, finding 4-bet spots himself. And he's right. Like, in a 2-5 game, you're probably just not going to see that stuff. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prepared for it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be capable of it.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's something where, it doesn't really exist out there very easily for someone to go on a 3-day camp and actually talk very high level poker with, someone who is playing in those ultra high stakes games.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like, that's like one of the big things I want to convey to everybody too, is that it's not a means of the stake level, right? Like, I'm not playing necessarily with the best in the world. Don't get me wrong, there are occasions where those guys are in there, but it's like, we're just playing bigger. I've played in tougher 10, 20, 40 lineups before in my time, for sure. And what I'm getting at is like, the opportunity to play that big is what's really important. And had I not prepared myself for that opportunity, then I would have just fell flat on my face and failed. And I did in the beginning, to be quite honest. It's a huge adjustment. So, you spend a lot of time where you're at stakes that are just uncomfortable to you, and you may not acknowledge it, but you're way beyond your threshold of pain, and you're just playing differently. You're lying down and you're just giving up too much. And all of that can be fixed off the felt. It's just about like removing yourself from the scenario, breaking it down to the nuts and bolts, and analyzing from all aspects, like what makes me uncomfortable, what doesn't. Basically just questioning each and every step of the decision tree as to why. Why am I doing this? Why are they doing that to combat? Why am I losing? Why am I targeting this guy? Why am I not targeting that guy? All these things can be answered, and they'll all equate to a higher bottom line at the end of the day.
Now, something that I think, at least historically has not necessarily been in the comfort zone of a lot of people, but people are becoming more aware of is mental game. And you even address some of that, at your particular camp. What's your thought about the evolution of the mental game and kind of the role it plays and how important it is to becoming or being a winning poker player?
Yeah, so that was like a really easy thing for me to embrace, I guess. After I had transferred to my second school in college, I was unequivocally the hardest worker there. I had been on campus for no more than a month and a half, and I received the third most votes for captaincy. And this is after my prior coach had told my now current coach that the reason he cut me is because I was lazy and a cancer to the team. So, I understood work, but when that work didn't equate to results, right? So I busted my hump. I got into the starting rotation, and I showed up every Sunday to pitch and just absolutely got demolished. I was a mental midget. I turned into this person who, like, when I wasn't reaping the rewards from the work I put in, I just crumbled up into a corner and sulked. And it didn't take long before I had somebody suggest that I reach out to the campus's sports psychologist. And it just changed everything for me. It was just like, again, it's closing the gap of knowledge, right? We most likely fail when we don't understand. So it was just speaking with this person, ironing some things out, and her just asking why. Why do you feel this way? Why do you feel you fail? And it's like starting to answer those questions made me start to understand, like, oh, well, I could do better. I'm just choosing not to. So when it came to moving towards poker, again, you spend the first third of your career, especially for guys my age who kind of didn't have anybody blazing the trail before us, you just spend the first third like an emotional wreck. You're riding the roller coaster with every single swing because though you understand that, there's variance involved, there's no real black and white way to quantify it. Like, you can't just know exactly when you're going to go on a downswing and stuff like that. And also, like, games were so soft back then that we were just generally playing under rolled. So you just spend yourself as a mess. It's like, I found myself broke numerous times. And when you're broke, you're forced to work. And the second time I had gone broke in 2012, I would basically spend, 2 to 5 hours a day just engulfed in poker strategy. And most of that was self-improvement. It was trying to get to the bottom of what's gotten me into this spot to begin with, because it's not a lack of talent. So have I just been that unlucky? Or are there things that I'm doing to myself that are allowing me to fail? And, I spent a ton of time just like doing a lot of research from the mental game aspect, studying psychology, studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like anything that I could get my hands on that could possibly lead me down the road to an answer, I did. And it's like when I became flush again, that's when I started doing work with both of you, because now it's like I have a better understanding of myself, but I'm by no means a professional when it comes to this stuff. So why wouldn't I employ somebody who does understand it to the fullest? It's like I lift weights as well, and I've been training since I was 15, but that doesn't mean I don't need a personal trainer.
Yeah, I think quite a few of the poker players have actually seen it in that same sense in terms of the mental game coach, that certainly when you reach a certain stake level, it is just a case of passing it to a professional and making sure everything's as optimal as it can possibly be.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's like Barry Bonds still had a hitting coach. It's like, there's only so much that you can perceive on your own without somebody else like giving you an outside point of view. And it's like, there's just no way in hell Barry Bonds' hitting coach is better than him at hitting a baseball. But he can help him analyze the tape and find these little loopholes or these little spots where he has holes in his swing or whatever the case may be that may just like go unseen otherwise.
You know, it's so interesting, too, because you do play at some of the highest stakes known to man or woman. What are some of the mental game leaks that you see maybe in some of your opponents?
Definitely not being very in the moment when it comes to like just how big the whole scenario is. Like, there's so many of us that just become numb to the fact that like these are the stakes I regularly play. And you know, for most of those guys in that game, they can handle it. Like the swings aren't that important to them. But I noticed them in a ton of scenarios just mentally checking out. You know, they're texting, they're doing whatever, they're very distracted, and poker is a secondary aspect of it. And you know, that's fine, especially for the bulk of the people who are playing in those games. Like, it's a release, it's not their livelihood. But you know, that being said, it's just like the brevity of it all, of a mistake in that game is incredibly costly. It's like you're losing a house potentially, and there's also no room to really grow if you're that removed from the whole scenario.
Yeah, I mean, and it's something, it seems quite incredible, doesn't it, when we literally are talking about people losing the amount of money that's a house, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, $1 million for a hand. And did it surprise you when you first started playing those stakes that there would be guys there playing it that way, you know, being distracted? Or was that something you were expecting as you stepped up to those levels?
I guess I kind of expected it, just because poker can be so dull in between, in the downtime. And, you know, I'm very guilty of it too. It's like, there are definitely days where my eyes are glued to my phone because something for one reason or another is more important than the task at hand.
Don't tell your mindset coaches this, man.
Yeah, no, I know. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just kind of like, I think it's just difficult for the mind to stay that sharp and focused for that duration. I mean, some of these sessions go like, you know, 12 to 36 hours. There have been games that like, I haven't necessarily played it myself, but have lasted like 3+ days where these guys are maybe quitting for a couple hours at a time. And so like, they're pretty resigned to just playing on autopilot the entire time, which in my opinion is an incredibly difficult way to play. But also it's like, from somebody who's been there before, it's also very difficult to get out of that mindset once you're in it, especially in the long hours, just because you're kind of beaten down by the whole process.
Yeah, it's like totally, you know, it's a tough process. And then just the mental strength that is required just must be incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you know, especially like the way I play with being so active and involved in so many hands, there are just so many small decisions that I need to make throughout the course of a night. A 5-hour session is draining. And, you know, if I had it my way, I would never play longer than that. But it's just like, you kind of have to strike while the iron's hot. And when you're presented an opportunity, you can't just like walk away from a game. So I have to prepare myself to like really stretch it out over the long haul and really like have these mental checks where it's like, are you still paying attention? Are you still doing what you're supposed to be doing? Like, did we miss a spot here? And, you know, sometimes it just requires a walk. Sometimes it requires like a lot more than that. But it's our responsibility for sure as players to take it upon ourselves and create these checks and balances that will allow you to be in the moment at all times.
And do you feel your sort of physical fitness and things like that play a big part in how you can play those longer sessions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased because it's like, I don't know any other way. I guess I've had like periods of my career where I was doing nothing but playing. And it's like, I would play for 14, 16 hours, sleep for 5 or 6, and then show right back up to the game. And I know how short of a period of time I could sustain that and how miserable I would feel throughout the course of it. And to be quite frank, looking back, I rarely won in those scenarios. It's just, it's too tough. There's such a lack of balance. And, you know, going all the way back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like, that's ultimately what it's about, right? It's like not having a linear list of priorities of like 1 through 5 and getting to them as you can, but just having this like fluid list that whatever in that moment is most important becomes your number one priority. That is like almost what equates to balance, right? So it's like, if family's most important right here in the here and now, then that's it. But somewhere along the line, getting to the gym will be most important, or eating, or, making money and doing your job, or friends, or whatever. But it's like, whenever you do that, whenever you set everything to high priority, whenever it calls for it, you create this sense of balance and almost like a sense of mental health.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because the base of that pyramid that you keep talking about, Maslow's hierarchy, you see it a lot of times, it's as a pyramid, and that base has to do with the physiological. So, eating, sleeping, fitness. And so if your base is not strong, then how can the rest of your pyramid be strong? And it sounds like that's what you're really saying. Hey, focus on those things.
Yeah. Kind of in the sense that we put so much of an emphasis on the base as a society that we begin to overvalue too many of the simple needs and undervalue all of the rest. So it's like, if you look at the base, it's things like shelter, food, and money, things like that. And we put such massive emphasis on that we then begin to forget about like health and, social health, mental health, all of these other things that are also necessary in order to survive. And the reality is, at the end of the day, those basic needs almost always take care of themselves as long as you're of sound mind and a reasonable person who's, willing to get out there and do it. So it doesn't take that much thought to actually like have shelter, have food, have a sustaining job, and things along those lines.
Yeah, as you say, it's the others that then bring that balance in as well. And in terms of the next course that you're going to be running, when is that coming up?
So we're going to do one right before the World Series begins. It's going to be May 25th to the 27th. Again, it's just going to be for 9 people. We keep the group small so that we can have everybody play at the RFID table. The hands get read during the session. We create a video out of it thereafter and provide coaching commentary. So everybody who attends basically gets a study tool thereafter to take with them. It's going to be based around cash again, and we're doing it right before the 300K because that's pretty much the start of the series. Like, I know I'm personally playing the 300K, but for everybody who isn't, 3 days later begins the Colossus, I believe.
Right. Yeah. The Colossus.
Yeah. From there, it's just all downhill. It's like every single day, there's going to be just something monumental to go on. So it's going to be kind of like a precursor to the series. And we're going to end it all with a bang and have a big party at the house afterwards. My buddy Brent Hanks is a good friend from high school. His band's coming out and playing that Saturday. So we're gonna do it right, start the summer off the right way.
All right. Usually we have to wait all the way till July 4th, but it's really nice to get it started at the beginning of the series.
Yeah, we'll do one then too.
All right.
Not a camp, but a party.
Now, I don't want to oversell this, but Matt's house is off the chain. The lot is amazing. It's a huge lot, swimming pool. I mean, the RFID table is amazing. I was there. I witnessed it all. I'm just saying, if you've got a few dollars you could put together, you don't want to miss out on this.
I appreciate the tag.
You're welcome.
And something we've got to ask you before you go, because I'm sure you've got a great story here. What is the most extreme example of tilt you've seen over the years in these games?
That's a great question. I do have one, but it's nowhere near as interesting as like a big game story, I guess. But so when I was coming up, I used to play all the underground games in Pittsburgh. And there was one in particular that was played in the basement of a restaurant. And the guy who ran it, I kid you not, his name was Mike the Greek. No idea what this man did for a living. All I know is that he wasn't allowed in Vegas. So, I mean, who knows what his backstory was. But to my knowledge, it was me and my buddy who played poker at the time for a living. This was like 2005, 2006. And then Mike the Greek, this other guy, Tony, who's just like the nicest guy on the planet, who runs a beverage company where they put beverage lines in stadiums. And then everybody else at the table was they were all quote unquote restaurant owners. But everyone else was a bookie or something along those lines, with one being a 75-year-old retired hitman. So needless to say, I was in good company. And we were playing one night, and to give you to set up the game the way it is, we're in this like cellar of a restaurant that's just like dark and concrete. And it has like a storm door leading out that we come in and out of with an armed guard on the inside of it, just in case. And we were playing, and it was getting late in the night. And this game was way too big for me. I probably had like 10,000 at the time. And I think I probably had 8 of it on the table. And a hand comes up where I think I limped in or raised with sixes, whatever the action was, I'm not sure. But Mike the Greek put in a big 3-bet. And he was in the 9 seat and I was in the 7 seat. So he makes it like 300 or 400 to go pre-flop or whatever. It comes back to me and I call. And the flop I remember very well was 7-3-2 with 2 spades. And I either led into him or check raised or whatever. Anyway, when it was all said and done, we got all the money in right then and there, where I had to call his shove for like 4,000. And I did. So I end up calling. It runs out in my favor. It runs out like 9-10 or something along those lines. And he tables Queen 8 of hearts for just like 2 overcards, right? And Tony, the man I was describing before, was sitting in the 2 seat across the table. And I mean this as sincerely as possible. He's just an absolute teddy bear, like the sweetest guy on the planet. And despite the fact that we played pretty hard against each other, he was like one of the guys I considered a friend in the game. And he stands up and puts his hands on his head and just screams, "Tell me you didn't see his cards. You had to have seen his cards. There's no way you made that call without seeing his cards." And, back then it was like that stuff just didn't happen. Like people didn't bluff. Like, it was a big deal, I guess. And I was just like kind of giving him a death stare. Like, know your company, buddy. Like, you're accusing me of cheating in front of a bunch of people who cheat for a living. And Mike gets up and slams the money down, ends the game right then and there. So that's the visual tilt that I saw, which doesn't sound all that bad, right? So I leave and the game runs again the following day. I show up. They're 8-handed. And mind you, for certain people, they'll make it 11. So I show up when they're 8-handed. Mike tells me that they're playing 8-handed that night and that I have the next seat. So I sit there. I sit like at the table and I'm waiting. And one of my buddies comes through the door. They pull up a seat for him. Now they're 9. Another guy walks in. They pull up a seat for him. Now they're 10. Third guy comes in. Now they're 11-handed. And I'm just like, what's going on here? And he goes, don't worry. You're first on the list. You have to understand these are my customers. I had to let them in. I'm like, okay. One guy quits. They pull a chair. Another guy quits. They pull a chair. So I sat there for the better part of 6 hours because apparently I had just no pride whatsoever. And eventually just get in the game at like 2 a.m. It breaks around me within a hand. And I was just like, well, I guess that's it. I'm never welcome back here again. I should be thankful I'm leaving here with my life, I guess.
Tough crowd, huh?
Yeah. At the time, it didn't feel like I was ever in any danger. But like looking back, I was probably not in the best scenario playing in those games.
Well, you moved to Vegas now, Matt, so you're all safe.
I feel way less safe here.
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can people find you on Twitter or your website or things like that?
My Twitter account is Berkey11, and the website for the camp is solveforwhyacademy.com.
And what we'll do is we'll put a link on the page for that as well. So on this podcast page, there'll be a link through to your website.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so everyone, highly recommend you check out the camp. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Matt. Good luck. I know you're currently chip leader in the Win tournament, so good luck this week.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Cheers, man. Bye.
See you guys.
Wow, some really great stuff there from Matt.
Oh, I mean, he's just such an amazing thinker when it comes to thinking about the game and just looking at it from all the angles and figuring it all out. I just wish I could hook my brain up to his brain and just get a full brain dump.
Just take that information down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a very, very interesting philosophy. It differs from a lot of players that I talk to. And it's really great to hear someone going out there doing training courses, not to try and teach some form of, get rich quick scheme, but actually trying to help other, higher stakes players understand the thinking process from jumping from something like 5-10 all the way up to those very, very big games.
Yeah, one thing that impresses me about him is that I know how much he cares for the game and he cares about the game and just the passion. I got an opportunity to go to the first camp he ran and I did a little mental game teaching at the camp. But, just being able to see him like in his element, the passion he has for the game, I really haven't seen anything quite close to that before.
Hey, I mean, as I say, lucky to have him on the show. And you're very lucky to go on the camp as well, Trisha. So that
I
sounds
know.
like quite a score.
You should see all the good tricks I learned. So I'm really excited to, get to play in a few live tournaments so that I can try out all the good stuff I learned.
Yeah, so you guys watch out if you see Trisha at the World Series. When you see Trisha at the World Series.
When?
Shouldn't say if. When you see Trisha at the World Series this year. So Trisha, where can people find out about you?
You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Trisha Cardner or check out my website, drtrishacardner.com.
And if you're interested in me or my services, check out my website, pokermindcoach.com, and there you can get my MP3s or you can get a free consultation. We'll talk to you all soon.
Bye, guys.
You've been listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast with Elliot Rowe and Dr. Trisha Cardner. To get any resources mentioned in the episode or to listen to past shows, visit pokermindcoach.com/TMA podcast. Thanks for listening.